We are back, and we are joined now by Amjad Iraqi, senior editor at 972 Magazine. Amjad's been on the program before. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, obviously, a really scary time right now in the occupied territory. Over the weekend, Israelis executed what you speak about in your piece as settler pogroms, which it was a multi-day raid, killed at least a dozen, including children. There was other violence, tear gas fired into hospitals, according to reports. Can you just catch our audience up on this latest instance of the horrific settler colonialism that I feel like we'll be covering till the end of time?
Yeah, it's unfortunately been quite an intensive couple of weeks in Israel-Palestine. This week, the biggest news story was this Israeli military operation that lasted for 2 days in the Jenin refugee camp, which is in the northern occupied West Bank. But to kind of understand how this particular operation came about, its most short-term retrospect is to go back just a couple of weeks. So even before the settler attacks happened, a few days before the pogroms happened, you actually had the Israeli military in Jenin refugee camp facing active hostilities through a raid into the camp, and they were met with Palestinian militants. And then there was quite an intensive fight to the point that even the Israeli soldiers were coming under serious threat, such that the Israeli army actually turned to air power, in this case, an Israeli Apache helicopter, which fired missiles into this battle zone, which was the first airstrike in the occupied West Bank in about 2 decades. Now, airstrikes are quite standard operation in the Gaza Strip, and so it's quite stark that this is happening in the West Bank for the first time since the Second Intifada. And then 2 days later, you had the Israeli army actually employ a drone strike in order to target the Palestinian militant cell, showing that this use of air power is once again returning to the West Bank for the first time in a long time. A few days after that, after there was a shooting attack in an Israeli settlement which killed 4 Israelis, you then had this several days of hundreds of Israeli settlers descending upon Palestinian villages, burning homes, burning cars, attacking Palestinian residents at will. At least 1 person, I think, was killed, and quite many wounded. And basically, all of this eventually culminated into the operation that we saw this week, a combination of the Israeli army being quite taken aback by the confrontations that they saw in the Jenin camp, and by the settler push to kind of instill their authority over the occupied West Bank, and such that the Israeli army decided to insert itself into the camp through this ground invasion with aerial assaults, leading to massive destruction and displacement. So this operation isn't happening in a vacuum. It's actually and this itself is part of a longer culmination of an operation in Jenin that's been going on for 1.5 years, as well as cities like Nablus and others. But this is the important kind of immediate context to understand how we got to this particular event.
Let's play this clip here. This is from Al Jazeera English. They got this video of bulldozers being driven by Israeli forces into Jenin, the refugee camp there, and we can talk a little bit about the significance of Jenin in a second. But this is some of the footage of homes just being demolished, communal spaces being destroyed by Israeli forces because they essentially got the green light for the settler colonial effort. I'll keep saying it by the Israeli courts. If you're listening on podcasts, you can just see these bulldozers pushing aside massive amounts of rubble in Jenin. Cars overturned. Just incredible amounts of destruction of a community. I think we got but I just wanted to show some of the images there because obviously these were communities. This is places that people lived, and this could be your hometown, right? And I just essentially what happened here is that Israel just said, well, then that's ours now. And when you see that kind of image, it just shows how the idea that this is a defensive operation in any capacity is so insane.
Yeah. I mean, this is the kind of the cruel irony of life in the occupied territories. So cities like Jenin and Nablus in the West Bank are theoretically supposed to be under the governance of the Palestinian Authority, according to the Oslo Accords. So in theory, it is the PA that is supposed to be in charge of like security and law enforcement and provision of needs, etc. But what's been the case under the provisions of Oslo and what we've seen in practice is that the Israeli army can go into Area A as it pleases. And this in addition to the military basically launching regular raids, especially in a place like Jenin, which has such a history of political and armed resistance. It's keeping in mind the large matrix of control that Israel has over the entire occupied territories. Not just in there's its land and there's its economy, its entire ability of freedom of movement and permit systems. Like all this is like cages upon cages that enwrap around this area. And so the kind of scenes that you're seeing right now in places like Jenin, the army claims that it's basically targeting with precision militants, but the way they're actually practicing the strategy is that every civilian area is itself a potential target. Every civilian area can be used and broken into and used to the military's advantage under the guise of a security operation. And so if you look at if you look at the ground, what's going on in Jenin right now, you'll see dozens of homes basically destroyed with holes that Israeli snipers also stationed themselves in as military posts. So it's turning the entire sort of urban fabric basically against the Palestinian population. Like nothing and no one is safe under military strategy.
And can you flesh out that strategy even more for the purpose of the Israeli government? Why they essentially want to take over Jenin, push out Palestinians, and what Jenin has been historically in relationship to Israel?
So Jenin has a long history of both like social and economic life for Palestinians, dating back way before the Nakba, and certainly afterwards as well, in terms of general political resistance as well as political activity as well as militant resistance. Like Jenin and Gaza are often kind of paired together as being quite these centers of trying to push back against Israeli rule and Israeli control. And it's precisely because of that identity, pardon the moss called background.
All good.
And it's part of that identity that has made it such a target of Israeli repression for such a long time. There's a reason why Jenin was also at the center, or much of the center of Israeli repressive policies during the Second Intifada about 20 years ago. And we're seeing this kind of return in more recent years. Now, in the past, Palestinian militant groups used to be primarily affiliated with particular political factions like Fatah and Hamas and Islamic Jihad. And while you certainly still have that today, what's really defining the militant groups these days is actually trying to steer away from these kind of political affiliations. It's actually quite a mix of different factional backgrounds and ideologies, and really driven by Palestinian youth, many of them who were born during or after Oslo, who've really just known a life of complete disillusionment, despair, and death. With the promise of Oslo and the promise of any sort of freedom and liberty is completely destroyed by the entrenchment of the occupation and the entrenchment of the system of apartheid. So these kind of militant groups have really posed a huge sort of problem for the Israeli authorities, in that there's no real political target to go to, and all they can do and rely on is this doctrine which they've applied, especially in the Gaza Strip, which they kind of euphemistically call mowing the lawn or mowing the grass. And the underlying principle of this idea is that there is no real solution to eradicate Palestinian resistance, no matter how hard we try and no matter how hard we beat Palestinians. And so the idea of mowing the grass is that we undercut their capacity, we assassinate some of their militants in an almost cyclical pattern, and then we'll be back the next time and the next time and the next time. And this is most closely associated with Gaza, and is manifested in many respects across the territories. But in Jenin, we saw that being played out in full force. It is just about undercutting that capacity for a little bit, but the raids are going to continue. The military control is going to continue. The targeting of any kind of political activity is going to continue. So this is the doctrine that's really playing out. And I would just highlight in particular, there's a reason why I keep mentioning this doctrine, how it's played out in Gaza, because there's often an exceptionalization of what's happening in the Gaza Strip, separate from the West Bank or the rest of Israel-Palestine. But what we're seeing in Jenin is the way that apartheid itself operates as a kind of multi-leveled or almost like a spectrum of institutions and methodologies, which are rooted in the same agenda of complete domination for Jewish Israelis and complete subjugation for Palestinians. And now the Israelis are trying to enact that even further, or to escalate those levels in places in the West Bank for the first time in quite a number of years.
I think that is so well said and really underscored by the fact that the Israeli court system sanctioned this, right? I mean, it gives this veneer of legality and respectability. When you look at international law, it completely flies in the face of that. When you look at just like the morality of it on its and what's truly happening, the plight of Palestinians, there's completely no justification. But through their more official appearing structures, they imbue their apartheid, the actions of apartheid, with like this artificial sense of order, when in reality what this is just a continuation of decades long of violence.
Absolutely. And here I want to quote actually a colleague, Lara Friedman from the Foundation for Middle East Peace, who really sums this up very well, in that there's a difference between rule of law and rule by law. And the way that Israeli domination and oppression operates is very much wrapped in systems of law, that there are court systems, there's legislation, there are complex legalistic institutions that are meant to justify and enable and make it appear as if there's a process to doing all this. And especially the case, the idea that if Palestinians have a grievance, that they can even go to the Israeli courts, or particularly the Supreme Court, in order to defend their rights. But all this, in the end, is just a complex machination that, in the end, still achieves the same objective. Whether the military goes in and completes an objective in 2 days, or if Israeli court process stretches it out to 10 days, but to stretch it out to 10 years, to displace a Palestinian village, or to evict Palestinian residents, or to legitimize a certain kind of military policy, including targeted assassinations, to confiscate and land in any form. The list goes on and on and on. And the Supreme Court, especially, has been a prime rubber stamp for anything from segregation to police brutality and lack of accountability. Even just today, for example. I don't know if some listeners might have heard that 3 years ago there was a young Palestinian autistic man in Jerusalem, Iyad al-Hallaq, who was killed by a border police officer in Jerusalem. And basically 3 years later, as of today, the Jerusalem District Court basically acquitted the officer and said that he made an honest mistake, quote unquote, in confusing Iyad as a terrorist instead of a man with a disability who was actually on his way to a school or for lessons, and that he was even accompanied by someone who was there screaming at the police officer that he's a disabled young man and that not to shoot. And the police commissioner welcomed the verdict. The border police commander welcomed the verdict. The national security minister, Tamar Ben-Gvir, welcomed it. And so this is the political, legal, and military system, all coalescing around that same agenda, supporting one another as much as possible. And in the end, Palestinians, even one of the most innocent people you can think of, is also basically, free to be killed with complete impunity.
I want to play this clip as well to get your take, Amjad, because Bradley, do we have this? Yeah. So this was, and you can give me context because obviously you cover this. This Arab member of Israeli parliament, Ayman Odeh, he spoke before a vote the other day, and he was speaking at least supportively for the Palestinian people. And this is essentially how he was silenced for saying anything of the sort.
אני יודע, רד למטה, תחזור למקום, הוא תקף אותם, הכל בסדר, תודה רבה, רד למטה, תודה רבה.
למה שיותר מחבלים
אנחנו נעבור.
למה שיותר מחבלים
סליחה רגע. אני מבקש לשבת, שב במקום.
So for people listening on the podcast, he says, "Take me down," but the Palestinian people will continue to fight. I mean, I don't have the knowledge to know really who this member of parliament is, what his significance is in the fight to get Palestinians some semblance of human and civil rights. But this is from the outside. What we see here in covering this is just if you're a police officer who kills an autistic or a man with autism who's Palestinian, there's no consequences for you. If you are if you're trying to go through an official Israeli institution and say, try to get recourse for your house being taken away from you by an Israeli settler, there's no path forward for you as a Palestinian in that way. And then even people within the parliament who are trying to speak out, they're silenced. And I'm curious about your perspective on what we just played there, and in general, the dynamic of how all of the official channels are blocked off, all of them, for any kind of justice. And it just must be immensely infuriating, to put it mildly. We are back with Amjad. Sorry for the technical difficulty, but yeah, Amjad, just if you don't mind responding to what we just played.
Yeah, so the gentleman you saw was Ayman Audi. So he's a very prominent Arab politician in the Israeli Knesset, the parliament. And he actually used to be the head of what was called the Joint List, which was a united slate of 4 different Arab political parties. And what you saw there is basically him being torn down, but taken away and shouted down by most of his colleagues who, whether it was Ayman or whether it was another Arab member of the Knesset, any time that the Palestinians are mentioned as a people who should be, recognized, as people should be respected in terms of acknowledging their identity or even challenging the occupation Israeli policies, that is basically the kind of treatment that they're going to be expected to get. And it's interesting because the lesson of people like the experience of Ayman Audi as someone who actually is kind of in the middle ground of the spectrum in of Palestinian politics in Israel, that he really tried to integrate, or maybe integrate's not the right word, but to really use a parliamentary system to his community's advantage, and trying to create a vision and promote a vision about national equality, like full equality for all of Israel's citizens, with an end to the occupation. But even that those basic principles, which in any other part of the world would be considered absolutely normal and based on basic human rights, in Israel is considered basically an existential threat. That for any Palestinian or any Jewish ally wanting to echo those views, to say that in the Knesset or on the streets in the protest or out in the media, is to basically threaten Israel as a Jewish state, is to threaten its supremacy and domination, is to enable the mindset, enable terrorism. Some form. So politics is that it doesn't want to consider this is the being this is the sad.
Amjad, I'm sorry, you cut out briefly at the end. We were able to catch most of it. Not sure if you can hear us now, but just want to thank you regardless for coming on. Amjad, I think I can see you now, right? if you can hear me, just let me know. But 972 Magazine, please check out Amjad's work over there. It's really awesome. What's great about 972 is that they are progressive. They speak and write about the plight of Palestinians in English. So I think it's really easy for a Western or like a US or UK audience to kind of digest. So definitely check out 972 Magazine.